All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to this session this afternoon. I know we're getting towards the end of the day, so we have a nice short session today, but wanted to really explore some real-life change management principles, especially focusing on the communication aspect when you're doing a zero-trust rollout. And we have talked a lot about the technical aspects, AI, ChatGPT, passkeys, everything that's exciting in the identity world, but eventually you're going to have to roll all those things out across your organization. And then that's where change management and communication really will come into play. So we're going to focus on those areas today. My name is Sarah Chu Villarmarzo, happy to be here today with you. So let's go ahead and dive in. So today we're going to talk through some best practices from real-world communications. We're going to touch on kind of the importance of communication, how to use it to frame everything that goes out, how to understand your stakeholders. Who are they? What are their needs? How are you going to frame your communications to tailor it to them and their specific needs? What are a couple of example communication types and how each can be kind of tailored and different for the user needs? How to emphasize the zero trust benefits or your rollout change management benefits and use that to kind of drive your communications forward. A couple of differences between things like internal, external stakeholders. I know the lines between those are kind of blurring now, but a couple of different aspects that you may want to consider during stakeholder engagement. And then we have a use case for going passwordless, pretty common example across different organizations nowadays. So we're going to explore how you can use communications in such an example. So let's start by talking about what is change management at a really high level. So it's basically your organization's approach to rolling out, sustaining new changes, especially for large or complex changes. And what we're focusing on here is really the people aspect. So understanding who is impacted by these changes, how are they impacted by the changes, both now and then kind of rolling down the line in the future. What's going to be the impact to them and why should they care? So you can use change management to kind of help your people understand what the change is going to be, how they're going to feel it, how they're going to respond to it, improve the predictability at every stage, help people understand what's coming down the pike so that they can be prepared to react to it at any time. It can also increase user buy-in and adoption, especially if there's like complex changes with different options or kind of like an opt-in thing that can help really drive up that user buy-in and promote the change in a sustainable way. And then provide a feedback loop also on the changes. So it's not necessarily just going to be one directional, you're going to also collect feedback throughout the process. Now, communication is really the foundation of any successful change management plan. So let's talk about a few principles of communication that you can use to kind of drive your change management through these ways. So first of all, think about it from kind of a multilateral perspective. This isn't going to be top-down, one way, just like blasting out words at people. You really want to create an environment where there's a feedback loop. So you're getting input as much as you're giving out input. This can help you kind of design a better product, understand your user needs, look for options for like automation, how to better the process. So you really want to keep that open door and make sure that you're gathering communication as much as you're putting it out. Also try and be proactive, especially for a large and complex change. You really don't want to spring things on people at the last minute. Try and kind of pre-think some of the issues that may arise, pre-think the impacts and how people are going to respond to it. That way you give people time to kind of digest things before they come into fruition. Also try and be transparent as much as practical. Now in a zero trust setting, of course, there's going to be some security items that you might not want to disclose, some things that you might want to keep confined to, certain user groups or whatnot. But as much as possible, do try and be transparent. This helps increase the user buy-in, helps increase that trust that you have with the stakeholders that you're engaging with. And then finally, do tailor it to your audience. Always keep your audience in mind. And your audience can be different types of people, different types of user groups. So let's talk a minute about who a stakeholder could be. So there's different groups. It's not just a user. You may have external parties that are interested in the change. For example, leadership could, maybe they don't interact directly with the change, but they do need to be aware of what's happening at the organization at a high level. It could be auditing groups or compliance needs, people that need to understand the change and the impacts, the metrics, things like that. Of course, your end users, but also people like system owners, admins, and then like third parties. So just really think about the change holistically and who is impacted from a different stakeholder perspective. I'm sure everyone here has had experiences both with strong communication as well as poor communication. So you've really probably seen examples in real life of what can go wrong as well as what can go right. So if you don't budget communication into your change management practices proactively, a lot of things can go wrong, or you might have kind of just a suboptimal rollout. So you might have low user adoption. People might not know that the change is coming, especially if it's an opt-in item. They might not know that that's available or what they have to do in order to maximize the change. Could generate user confusion. This could this could drive up your help desk costs, things like that, support needs. There's also the threat of shadow IT. People are always going to take the path that they're most comfortable with, even if it's not, especially in the case of Zero Trust, you're trying to optimize everything and make things more easy for the user. But if they're more comfortable with kind of a previous method, it could drive up that shadow IT, unfortunately. And then you can also have service interruptions or a security lapse. So, of course, these effects do have the potential to be very public. Nobody wants to end up in the headlines. On the other hand, if you build in strong communications, a lot can go right. You can increase the user buy-in, create change champions across the organization. You can have a smoother rollout. I guarantee with more communication, you will have a smoother rollout. People know what to expect, and people know it's coming, and they're ready for it. More transparency throughout the process will reduce your risk as well. So in short, all of the benefits of Zero Trust expanded. So let's talk a little bit about stakeholders in particular. And here's a couple of aspects that we can think about how to engage our stakeholders in a meaningful way. So first, think about who they are. So this could be literally mapping them out. You can create like a stakeholder engagement document or just any way to kind of list out your stakeholder groups, who they are. And again, think about who is going to be impacted by this change. And it can often go beyond just the users of the change or people that are going to be directly interacting with it. Think about leadership, think about external parties, third parties, anyone like policy people as well that may need to be updated. So map them out into kind of a stakeholder engagement document. And this can be kind of a living document that will inform your future plans, could inform your comms plan, could inform just like other documentation that would spring from this. Then you can start to think through for each group, what do they do? What do they need? Who are they? Like from a user perspective, this is where you start to think through some of those access control needs. What are their user types? What are their roles? Any access considerations, data classification, things like that. That's where you can start to get a little bit more granular in terms of thinking through the impacts for each user group. And this is where some policy maintenance may be updated as well. When you're engaging your stakeholders, what do they think? What are their pain points? Are there any automation opportunities? Are there specific communication needs that you think that they're going to have? Will they need training? Will they need a role update, things like that? This can also help you design a better product by engaging the stakeholders, understanding them, working with them to kind of design the rollout as well. And then you get even more granular. What do they need? This is where you map out your specific communication types as well as a timeline. So think through, what exactly are they going to need in terms of your communications with them, designing the training, making those communications available, and then thinking through the timeline as well. Now, here's a couple of communication types This is just a small sample. There's a wide variety, but you can have kind of a variety from less formal to more formal. So you could do announcements. That could be an email announcement, could be like even a sign posted on the board. You can have press releases for like kind of an external audience. It might be that two-way communication, so surveys, focus groups, training, things like that. And you can also think here about a reference site. So a place for people to go back and find more information if they're interested or if they need assistance. A good rule of thumb here is to kind of begin with the what and the why, what's going to be happening and why are we doing it, what's the driver. And then you can get more granular into kind of the when, the how, the details of the rollout. All right, so for our last topic, before we dive into the use case, just wanted to spend a little time about this specific kind of differentiation between internal versus external stakeholders. Now, in a zero trust context, as we kind of mentioned, the lines between internal and external traditionally are definitely starting to blur. People are mixing much more fluidly. There's different entry points and things like that. But what we mean here is essentially, are you an enterprise user or are you kind of like an external or public user that only interacts with the organization kind of tangentially? So you can treat these two user groups with a little bit of finesse. So for internals, it's going to be much more kind of a fluid, ongoing dialogue between you and your internal stakeholders. They're part of the organization. They're bought into the success of the organization. So you really want to be working with them throughout the process constantly to help design and make the best product that you can. Versus an external, they might interact with your product or service, but not necessarily be like invested in the product or the organization's success. So your information may be a little bit more one way, a little bit more controlled. Not to say that you don't engage them in public user groups and getting their feedback. That's also important, but you do control the narrative just a little bit more. You may also just want to make sure that you compare for example, the reference sites or internal materials and policies. For the external folks, just make sure that that information is publicly available, that you're kind of limiting the sensitive information that's going out there and just making sure that everything that goes out to the public audience has been cleared for distribution. You just want to take a little bit more care, make sure that those things are a little bit more finalized before you send those out. So just a couple of things to think about when you're kind of dealing with enterprise versus external users. All right, so let's dive into our use case. A lot of organizations now are undertaking a shift towards more of a passwordless authentication schema. So let's look at what that could look like from a change management and communications perspective. So here's our Acme company. They've determined that through their business need, they would love a passwordless MFA solution for their enterprise users, mandatory, no exceptions, for compliance and security needs. So that's what they've decided to go with for their enterprise users. And then they also have, in this case, a public site. So for those users of the public-facing application, they're going to have the option to go passwordless. They can still maintain their other MFA, their SMS, or their authenticator, their other options as well. So that's kind of the business case that we're working with. For considerations before the company is determining their change management strategy, they're going to think about timeline. They're going to think about compliance needs. Are there anything specific that they need to get done? Is there a specific timeline that they want or need to go through before rolling this out? So thinking through those compliance and timeline needs. Also, what are your security needs? What's the driver? What are the drivers behind this from a security perspective? And then that also ties into the maturity of their IT infrastructure. So this could be, very different infrastructures for like their internal site versus their external site. What does that look like? How do you? What are the impacts going to be? Does that affect the timeline? Things like that. And then finally, what are your user demographics? Who are the users and stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this? Do they have the devices or the technology available to be able to support and sustain this change? So thinking through all of those items. When they're actually managing the change, they can start with thinking through these things, and it's not necessarily this linear. There's going to be some iteration and some feedback throughout the process. But generally speaking, you can start by identifying the business case. And this is a great place to start because you think through kind of your drivers for change and what are the benefits that you're going to be driving towards. And so by starting with the business case, you can really use that information and those benefits to drive all the rest of your communications. And that way you can really hammer home at each stage the why. The what are we doing this for? How's it going to benefit me? How's it going to benefit the company? What are the changes? Why are we trying to undertake this change? And that will really help drive home the message. Then you can map out your stakeholders. So this is what we talked about a little bit earlier. Who is everyone that's going to be impacted? Users, leadership, auditors, external parties, everyone. Who are they going to be and how are they going to be impacted? And that's when you can start to think through those items like, what are my communication types? What are my timelines? What training are they going to need? Start to design those communications. You can meet with stakeholders once you have an idea of who they are. This is great to start to get their input, get that feedback. What do they think? Are there things that you may not have thought of during your initial planning? And then they can help raise those potential challenges so that you can solve them together, bypass them down the road so there's no surprises during the rollout. And you can start to execute those comms. This may look different for every organization, but it could be like an announcement, could be some training that gets rolled out 6 months before. What is passwordless MFA? Here's some additional resources. And then maybe you're having like countdowns. Okay, 1 month left to enroll your new devices. Okay, 2 weeks left until to enroll your new device. And then when you have cutover day, you can deploy the solution. Hopefully everyone knows what to expect. Everyone's been prepped, everyone's ready, they have their device ready. If there's any pre-activity that has to have taken place, it will have taken place because you've been proactive with planning it. And then finally, monitoring is always critical throughout the process and after. So this is both kind of like active monitoring, thinking through, okay, how did that go? Lessons learned. Are we seeing the change roll out in the way that we had planned, in the way that we are interested in? As well as just sort of like continuous technical monitoring. What's the adoption rate? What's the usage? Are people using it in the way that we had wanted them to? And then throughout the process, of course, you can have your continuous improvement and iterative feedback, making sure that you keep that open door and receive feedback throughout the process to make sure that things are going smoothly. So just to sum up, a couple of leading practices for you to consider when you're thinking through your change management strategy. Do try and plan ahead. Don't leave things to the last minute. Otherwise, you may encounter surprises that you weren't ready for. You can also check for materials that already exist. Hopefully, you don't have to start from scratch, especially if there's templates or organizational materials that you can kind of reuse, repurpose. That can be a great place to get started. Do tailor your materials to your audience and your needs. Spend time understanding their needs, understanding who they are, talking to them, engaging them. When you're designing your comms, make sure to use plain language, highlight the benefits of Zero Trust. There is a reason that everyone is doing this at the organization. Here they are, XYZ. Here's the impact and benefit to you, XYZ. And then finally, keep an open door. So, everyone has a stake. They're a stakeholder, so they have a vested interest in this going well in some way, shape, or form. So keep that open door. Make sure you're collecting feedback early, often throughout the process, both proactively as well as throughout the monitoring section. And that way you can make sure that the change is not only rolled out smoothly, but also maintains stability and sustainability in the years to come. All right, that's all for our talk today. I think we have a couple minutes left for questions, if there's any.
Yeah, I'm just curious, in your own experience and from the experience of your colleagues that you talk with, what personas, what roles, what folks give you the most pushback when it's like you're really trying to roll out a zero trust initiative?
Yeah, that's a great question. What roles or personas or stakeholders have historically given the most pushback? And I would say it has to be folks that are external to the organization are often the hardest to sell on the change, especially sometimes there's no existing communication channel that you can use that they're regularly checking, especially if it's like a widespread organization with a really big user population. It's hard to get those communications out there, so it's hard to communicate the benefits. They're also the most diverse population, typically speaking, so it's really hard to tailor the communication to their specific needs and to their specific impacts. So that's been a little bit tricky, but things like focus groups, user groups, surveys, as well as kind of more proactive communication can help bypass some of those challenges. Great question.
Thank you. How, as part of both a stakeholder to a team and being part of a team, can you be more involved with the change management process that seems to be a bit closed off from even within a team within the organization?
Yeah, great question. So if the change management seems to be happening at a certain level, how do we get more people involved in that process? And that's where kind of the organizational transparency is really important. I think nowadays it's becoming more acceptable for people to kind of make their own needs known if they're interested in becoming a part of the process. I do encourage people to try and feel empowered. Every company culture is different, but typically speaking, it could just be an oversight that they're not including certain employees or certain user groups within the change management process. So do be empowered to speak up if you feel like there's a change you'd like to be a part of, but it's also really incumbent on leadership and the change management kind of leaders of whatever change is being rolled out to make sure that they're being super inclusive, make sure they have that open door so that they can collect feedback from across the whole organization, because it's not going to just impact one set of stakeholders. It's going to impact a variety of folks across the organization. Good question.
From an enterprise perspective, what mode of communication have you found to be the most effective, where you get the most feedback and where you see that there is engagement?
Yeah, another great question. What's the best kind of medium for putting out effective communications? And I think that also depends on the organization, but things that people check anyway is usually a good starting place. So if your organization is really involved in Teams, Microsoft Teams, for example, putting out a Teams announcement or Teams training could be a good way. If people are more kind of email-centric, using that channel a little bit more. If you're in person, it could be even physical notices posted somewhere. So it's kind of understanding your company culture and trying to use and capitalize on the methods and channels that you guys already use.
All right, I actually have a question. At what point in my project should I start planning the change management?
Yes, change management is great to get started at any point. If you are just thinking through the potential for new change, you can start to at least think through some of the potential impacts downstream and who might be impacted. So you can get started pretty early. It doesn't have to be like a big commitment at the time. You can just start to kind of think through some of the potential impacts, think through some of the potential stakeholders, and then from there, as you start to engage those folks, things may become more crystallized, more clear. You can start to fill in the details and make it a little bit more formal. Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, Sarah, thank you very much for your talk today. It was wonderful.
Thanks so much, everyone.